All right. We are now live. Welcome everyone to today's discussion about challenges in ESG data. Great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jame DiBiasio. I will be your host and moderator today. I'm the founder and editor of DigFin, covering all things around digital finance, fintech, and digital assets, including fintech and ESG. And you can see all of our stuff at digfingroup.com. We have a terrific lineup of speakers this morning in Hong Kong and Singapore. We have people from both the asset management world, the security services world, and the asset ownership side. And these are all people that have been really steeped in this topic for their careers. So you're listening to people that are really at the top of their game when it comes to these questions. So I'll just very quickly introduce them. From Fidelity International, we have Marion O'Donnell, who is Director for Sustainable Investing based in Singapore. Marion, good morning.
Good morning.
Great to have you here. And her peer from the asset management side at GMO, also in Singapore, Hardik Shah, who is head of ESG practice for the region. Hardik, great to have you this morning.
Likewise. Good morning, everyone.
From Prudential Corporation Asia in Hong Kong, we have Liza Jansen, specialist in insurance investment. Lisa, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And finally, from Singapore at State Street, Konstantina Founta, who is head of risk analytics for Asia Pacific. Konstantina, good morning. Great to have you. So I'd like to start with Marion from Fidelity and talk a little bit about from an Asia PAC perspective, what are the key differences? Because a lot of the providers of data are from the European Union or other places. Tell us a little bit about how the quality and the availability of data for Asia has changed over the past couple of years.
Yeah, sure. So I think, as you said, the ESG market, it's growing rapidly. Data is key for investment managers. And in Asia, also, I'd say there are definite improvements over the last couple of years, but we still have some way to go. I think there's a few different issues. There's definitely less regulations over in Asia when it comes to reporting, and that's obvious. I think there are a lot of Asia companies who really want to be more transparent and they want to disclose more, but there's probably a lack of understanding exactly what's required of them, exactly how they need to report. There's international standards. Which one should they be reporting to is an issue. What sort of information is most material for them to report against? What sort of methodologies should they use? So there's definitely a lot of question marks, I think, still with Asian companies. From our perspective, we'll always go to the company first and really kind of work with them on materiality, on the governance of sustainability, what they should be reporting on, what standards will really be relevant to them. But yeah, I think overall, there's definitely been improvements, but probably more to go.
Hardik, what is the relationship in this region between, I guess, the regulatory impetus for companies to report and disclose versus, I guess, maybe on the vendor side, the availability of what you can get? So do these correlate one for one, or are they different questions?
I think, unfortunately, in many cases, these are different questions, and that kind of adds to the burden the corporates have in terms of reporting. I think most of you would have heard of the ESG ratings don't necessarily correlate at all. So MSCI is asking them something else versus Sustainalytics versus 100 others that have cropped up in the last 3 years. So I kind of understand corporates' kind of dilemma in terms of what should we report on. I think in that kind of perspective, I agree with Marion, where I think the corporate should themselves decide, depending on their business lines that they operate in, what data is the most material and that they should essentially act on. The regulations, especially in this part of the world, are important to kind of give that drive or the push to corporates to disclose. In many cases, there are stock exchanges kind of giving you, let's say, here's the basic template. So this is what you can start from and then build on later on. So I think that's really important to just kind of get more consistent and widely available disclosure, but unfortunately, it's also not consistent even between Singapore and Hong Kong. Then you kind of put in Thailand, Indonesia, everyone in the mix, and it's kind of going all over the place. So I think that's something that we need to work on.
Liza, from a point of view of an insurance company that is, trying to integrate this both from an investment point of view as well as for your policyholders, how are you finding the experience in Asia compared to Europe? What is the difference in the way that you are able to incorporate ESG into your business?
Well, different level of quality of ESG data is obviously making things very challenging. In many markets in which we operate, we don't have ESG data at all. So we completely rely on engagement with the company, which makes it from an asset owner perspective very difficult because we can't create any consistency across our markets and we can't report on it. Although I do think engagement with the company is a good way to get a lot of information. But then actually using the ESG data is also so challenging and so different across different markets. I mean, it depends on substitutes available in the market. It depends on liquidity, just general market circumstances, and those differ so much. I mean, Malaysia, Indonesia is so different from Hong Kong that even from a policy perspective, this is very difficult to come up with something that works for everyone. So at some point, you need differentiation between the different markets and accept that the local circumstances are different and try to find a way to work with it. But in the end, as Marion said as well, you have to start with companies themselves and engage with them.
Okay, so I'm hearing a lot from our speakers about the need for engaging with the companies. So it sounds very intensive, very, very human conversations rather than sort of a quantitative data kind of plug and play kind of solution. Konstantina, you deal with risk analytics day to day. What's been your experience with being able to marshal different sources of data that can maybe help accommodate some of these differences that we have across Asia?
So just on the point on differences between Asia and the rest of the world, yeah, regulation is one, and I mean the lack of regulation or the different segments of the markets across Asia and how they approach ESG. And a bit mainly in APAC region, ESG is driven by investors, and also in Asia, we have the biggest or most of the biggest asset owners here that they dominate the market, and the level of sophistication across them is different. So that's one thing. Now on the data side, and here in State Street, we made a strategic decision that ESG should not be seen in isolation, and that's why we have incorporated ESG data within our investment analytics platform, and that helps our clients in multiple ways. One is the data sourcing, and the data vendors, as we said, different vendors, different approaches, different methodologies, quite often low correlations. So, and as you said, Jame, there is no single source of truth. So I think the ESG reporting should be based on a flexible system that has the ability to source more than one vendor data. I think we have the analyst-driven methodologies, artificial intelligence methodologies that they don't seem to compete, but to complete each other. And also when it comes to applying the scores to the assets of the asset manager, the asset owner, and so on. It's about mapping scores, holdings, is about and enriching the data, is about validating the data and creating a consistent set of analytics, including ESG analytics that can be incorporated the front office, the middle office, the risk management, and also the back office, the compliance functions and regulatory reporting when applicable. So the challenge is huge. Consistency is the key to me, and that's what we try to address.
Konstantina, is there a big difference in when you're dealing with ESG related data versus other types of market information?
Well, on the data management component, as most of the market participants will say, it's the same pain, right? Finding the vendor, connecting with the vendor, loading data, receiving data, plug it into any systems you wanted to see. So this is challenge number one, the data component, and this is the same. This is the same across any analytic. The challenge with the ESG is that it needs to be mapped on individual securities, because the ESG scores are not like, they're not, you get data on a company level, not on a holding level. So you need to map that to your actual holdings. And then, of course, aggregation levels, how you want to see what positions you want to exclude. Like the flexibility is key on the system. And that's why, treating ESG as another set of analytics works when a data management component and the processing component, but when it comes to reporting, it has its own challenges. Again, frameworks, investor driven, there is no off-the-shelf solution, as you said.
Yeah, okay. Marion, I know that you guys work with a fintech specialist to help you with this. How do you figure out what is material, and is that different in different markets or regions?
So when it comes to materiality, yes, I say it depends on more the sector. Rather than, and there will be a regional, I guess, bias as well, but it would be more kind of what sector we're looking at, and we'll look at what's most material for them. Yeah, so we use, I guess, as I said, our first point of information is the company itself, speaking to them, what they publish. Then we do use third-party data to plug it into our systems to complement kind of that sort of company research. And we have joined up with a fintech based in Denmark called Matter. And the reason of joining up with them was to create a very specific and proprietary sustainability report on some of our funds, our sustainable funds. We wanted to be really transparent on those funds and really draw out the most material KPIs that we could report on those funds. We joined with Matter because they were very flexible. They had quite reliable data sources that we could use. And really the aim of these reports is to create kind of a story and a transparent report for the end investor to really understand how sustainable actually are our funds. And not only because of regulation, but we are under constant pressure to be as transparent and to provide as much disclosure, especially on our sustainability funds. So this partnership has really kind of met that mark.
When you talk about that story about the sustainability of the funds, does that have to vary if you're operating in a region where mandatory disclosures may be missing or light, or where just the capital markets themselves are quite thin? How do you sort of navigate the challenges where you may not know exactly what you're dealing with? So
that was quite important for us to try and have some consistency across the regions, because our funds are kind of broad. They do relate to different regions. They're global. So we've been quite specific on the KPIs we've chosen, ones that we feel we've got enough data. The company that we're working with, Matter, they use a few algorithms, they use AI, et cetera, to kind of draw information from a variety of different sources. It's important for us to obviously trust those sources, which we've done a lot of legwork in order to get a good understanding of them. Yes, there will be sometimes KPIs that we need to change slightly dependent on the region, but we've tried to really concentrate on important pieces of information and data that we have enough information on to make it a global report.
How just on that point, in Asia, we've heard a little bit about regulation being less here than in Europe, for better, for worse. When that's the case, are you able to deliver a consistent story? Let's say a sector like for like between Europe and Asia?
It's a struggle, I would say. Obviously the data issue is there. It is a struggle. What I would say about Asian companies is that there may be quite a lack of disclosure, but from what we're finding, there are more and more companies are doing a lot when it comes to climate risk, when it comes to human rights management, etc. There's more there than is what is visible. You do have to scrape the barrel sometimes to get that information. You really have to push disclosure. You have to push the sources that you're looking at. But yes, there still is an inconsistency. I'm not going to lie, there's definitely an inconsistency in information, but there's more there than what's visible, I think.
Okay, more than meets the eye. Hardik, when we were talking in the run up to this event, you had a comment I found really interesting, which was, 5 years ago, the problem was lack of data. Today, there might be too much data, or at least very difficult to figure out what's what. We've been hearing that we're not getting as much as we would like from corporates in Asia, but maybe you can explain a little bit about what you mean, like this excess of data and the challenges that brings. Is that a regional problem or a European problem, or is that something that is happening everywhere?
Yeah, I think in my view, it's a global problem. I remember like speaking at conferences back in 2015, and we were like, in Asia, in emerging markets, there's hardly any ESG disclosure, so we can't kind of get a meaningful ESG view. I think that the kind of spectrum is on the other side now. There's just too much data that corporates are reporting, and in most cases, a lot of it is noise, and that is where I think for investors like us, it's a big challenge, because you don't want to see sustainability reports with like CEOs holding babies and visiting like kind of poor communities, and that's good to do, but that's not the most material thing that the company has to kind of focus on in most cases. So you want the right amount of data. So I always kind of say this, that as an analyst, as an ESG analyst, I would like 3 pages of black and white statistics, and I'm very happy with that, rather than 50 pages of pictures and like employee photos and everything else, and essentially. So I think that's generally where there's a bit of, I would say, a discrepancy. But I think we were talking about materiality a little time back, and I think just maybe a couple of points on that I like to make. One thing is very important is materiality is not the same across industries. So you have to kind of customize it depending on what industry you're looking at. So the issues that matter will differ from industry to industry. So they never kind of try and get, here are the 20 indicators across all of our companies that I'm going to look at. So that doesn't work. And the second thing is whenever rating agencies expand coverage, let's say in the mid-cap, small-cap space, or maybe further in the emerging and frontier markets, more often than not, a majority of the new companies being covered will get a CCC rating, let's say worst of the worst. And that doesn't always mean these are like the worst offenders. And I would say in majority of the cases, it's just lack of disclosure. So my experience has been over a period of time, you'll see these companies understand what investors are looking for, or what these rating agencies are looking for on behalf of investors, and then you'll see the upgrades happening. So don't always, I would say, give too much weight to the third-party ratings per se. In my view, it's a good starting point, but you have to do your own thinking, especially for active managers like ourselves. That's the value add I think we bring on the table.
Right. Okay. And is there a big discrepancy between what the regulations require for disclosure and what you find valuable? Like, are the regulators asking for the right information?
Yeah, I think in most cases, yes. So the difference is maybe the regulators are kind of creating a minimum baseline, and let's say investors would want slightly more data than that. So I wouldn't say these are misaligned per se. So think about, let's say, Singapore and the monetary authority here, they're pushing quite heavily on TCFD aligned climate risk disclosures. They're pushing heavily on I think the stock exchange here almost 4 years back now started kind of pushing companies to say, okay, if you want to be listed on SGX, you have to disclose minimum sustainability information. So I would say it's steps in the right direction. And again, the smart companies, the companies that want to get more attention, would go above and beyond the minimum requirements. But I think it's fairly fine for companies to start with that and then build gradually again. I mean, the Unilevers of the world weren't reporting that good 10 years back as they are today. So it's just a process of maturity.
Yeah. Okay. We've got our first question from the audience, which sort of segues something I want to ask Liza. So I'm going to run this. And so thank you for the question. And we welcome questions from the audience. So go to your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So this question is for you, Liza. Is there anything that stops asset owners, instead of having to have one-on-one discussions with portfolio companies, as everyone here has already talked about, instead, can they say, look, just please follow, SASB or whatever standard, accounting standard disclosures by this time next year, and boom, you sort of make them do it. Is that realistic?
Well, that is what I'm trying to do through a policy, just to set like a minimum standards that everyone has to follow. Because at some point, as an asset owner, we need some consistency. Otherwise, for us, it's just too difficult to report back to our stakeholders. So we have to show what we're doing. So yes, I'm using things like SASB and frameworks just to set a minimum standard, but then allowing some flexibility and kind of a comply or explain the principle. Take this framework, try to implement as much as possible. Let me know if it doesn't work, and then we can work together on what we can do, or give me some other information. But I do think, in my experience, sometimes this lack of ESG data can also be used as an excuse not to do anything. So I also feel like I should be pushing investment managers to then go talk to the company, then try to find other sources of data, because often not. I mean, it really depends on the investment manager, on the market and everything, but it could be the case that they're not looking into it enough. And then definitely frameworks like this help, because it helps standardize, and it also gives guidance. People often need help how to view this ESG data issue. I mean, it's so overwhelming. There's so much research out there. If you just subscribe to some newsletters and you get so much, it's like for a lot of people, they just don't know how to start, where to start. So it helps if you give them like a minimum.
Is there a point, do you think, Liza, where there will be enough companies and your managers, pursuing these, that we will go from a highly qualitative engagement process to something that's more, plug your data into an API and it'll just filter into your system?
Yeah, in some markets we do this. I mean, we do invest passively as well. And then an ESG benchmark could be a way of how to implement this passively. And those ESG benchmarks are sometimes really, they have a good performance. So I do think it's possible, but you need a large investment universe. You need really good quality data, which we have for some parts of our markets. So Hong Kong and Singapore, who can invest globally, this is fine. Everything else, Vietnam, Indonesia, even we're investing in Cambodia. This is just not feasible. But there, in those markets, the positive side on ESG is very interesting, because that's actually my favorite part, where sustainability and investments actually meet. I mean, there are so many challenges in those markets. They lead to make the energy transition. They're looking to finance this with local currency bonds, long-dated bonds. It's something we are actually looking for as an asset owner. So this is at the same time where those two things meet. It has its own ESG data issues, obviously, but there's always, if you can't do it systematically, then often you do have other options. So it really depends on the market.
Okay.
Maybe if I can weigh in on that, the plug and play comment. I think some of it is already happening. As an active manager, I think I'm happy that it's not yet plug and play, because that's where you get to add your value. You kind of, if you do your kind of research and thinking correctly, there is the way I like to see this is there is kind of this market inefficiency with regards to ESG. Nobody knows what's the right answer. Nobody knows what's the right set of things to look at. So there's always going to be this differential view, which is, I think, good for generally kind of markets to function in some ways. And then I think that's very important. But I think even in the future, when things kind of become more standardized, there will be, I would say, certain areas where you will have to have some sort of fundamental override or fundamental view. So again, I go back to my previous point where you use the ESG ratings or scores as a starting point, but like if you're kind of setting things like, okay, if the score is below 3 on 10, then I don't invest. I mean, that could be fine for a starting, like an early stage asset manager, but that's not going to take you much further.
Yeah, but how do you need to budget for that? We're talking about a lot of qualitative work, and we just got a question in as well that says it's good to utilize multiple sources of ESG data, but budgets are limited. what criteria would you apply to select an ESG vendor if you're limited to just one, or let's say one or two?
Yeah, so maybe I can touch upon that. And I think we are dealing with this on a daily basis. So yes, ESG data has become crazy expensive. And I mean, even 2-3 years back, the vendors that we are looking at are now 4 times the price. So that's, I would say, the side effect of this huge interest in ESG information. So that's a challenge. I think in my view, when you're looking to choose a vendor, I think what is more important is you understand their methodology really well, and is that something that you are comfortable with, right? So are they having a set of 100 analysts looking at data and kind of rating stuff? Are they using machine learning and artificial intelligence to actually scrape through the internet and populate data more real time, or let's say more systematically? These are the things that you need to figure out. And let's take our example as well, right? So predominantly we are a quantitative manager, right? So a lot of our funds are quant in nature, but we do have some fundamental strategies as well. The type of ESG information both need is very different. So for a quant, you just need a score or maybe a set of ESG scores that they will kind of in some ways integrate into their investment process. Whereas for a fundamental guy, the score is just a reference point. They need to dig deeper, speak to the company management, have a more qualitative view. So let's say a company has been involved in a controversy. So that's basically a past information. Market has more or less priced that in. What's next? Are they improving? So these are the type of things that the fundamental guy would want to focus more on. So I would say there are different needs that you would have. So figure out the methodology of the vendor itself. Like, are you aligned with that? What is your requirement? So do you need more numbers and broader coverage, or do you need just, let's say, in-depth analysis, or you want to read reports like an ESG analyst reports? I think depending on that, you could choose different vendors, and obviously cost is another thing that you need to keep in mind.
Konstantina, what's your experience when you're dealing with asset managers and helping them source data? Because you operate with a number of different vendors. What are you finding? Where's the demand right now? And when it comes to this issue of cost, where are you finding value?
Yeah, let's start with the point that evaluating data vendors has a cost as well, because there's so many out there. Time is money. You can spend months or even years evaluating vendors. So obviously there are the big names out there that there is a big demand, and the direct competitors. But there is also, apart from the data coverage, and so it's also the focus of the vendor, right? There are specific vendors that focus on climate. So they do very in-depth research on climate, transitional risks, physical risks, stress testing, and so on. But maybe they don't focus that much on the G and the S. Mm-hmm. So you may get amazing coverage on the E, but nothing on the S and G. So you may need someone else that focuses on governance, on controversies, on other aspects. If you also include ethical screening, you need to have business involvement analysis and so on. So it's not about coverage per se, it's like the focus. So for example, in Australia, we also have the regulation on modern slavery. So you need to have, focus on labor practices and the human rights and all that. So it's tricky. It's tricky. So in Asia, there is a big focus in APAC, region, there is a big focus on climate, for sure. And we've seen this being also supported by the regulators in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and in Australia as well, with a consultation paper that came recently out. But we do have local demand for governance checks, especially in the countries that there is corruption, in countries that companies would like to see a positive impact on the society, like creating jobs and so on, charitable work and all that aspects. So it's tricky, and as I said before, and you said as well, that there is no single source of truth, and we see that in Europe. during building, an SFDR solution, there is not a single vendor that covers 100% of the requirements. It's interesting, like we have gone through the assessment of the different vendors and the coverage they have with the requirements. You see one score 70%, two of them may take you to 90%, three of them may take you to 98%, and so on. So it's really tricky, and with the cost, that's it's a function. It's a function. Like what you're going to get at the end, you plug in the parameters, you assess where you're gonna go, what data you need to get, what is more important to you, and you optimize that function. And obviously it's a journey, right? There's nothing static in ESG. Everything is changing. Data change, requirements change. So market participants need to be ready to, evolve their reporting as well.
Yeah.
So flexibility again is key.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. Please keep them coming. We welcome those. One is for Marion. So this person says, it sounds like your ESG reporting utilizing data from your fintech partner Matter has a client first approach, which is great. Curious if you are using the data beyond client reporting and how you align yourself with global frameworks. So I guess they're trying to figure out, to what extent is your emphasis on specific client needs, or are you trying to align it to a global template?
So absolutely, it was the whole focus of this was a client-based report. That's what we wanted to create, and we wanted to create something where we could have sustainability KPIs and integrate also our KPIs, so our engagement stats, our proxy voting stats, etc., into one report, so that we can be as transparent as possible to the client and they can kind of understand the sustainability of our funds. But absolutely, we're going to leverage that data internally. That data will be accessible to our portfolio managers so that they can see the impact of their funds, how sustainable it is. It'll also be accessible to our analysts when they're looking at kind of weaknesses or strengths in a fund and kind of where they can kind of push more engagement, for example. So absolutely, we'll be leveraging them internally. Any data points we can, we will leverage. As to global standards, I mean, we are looking at this report as to kind of how useful it is for a lot of global standards. How useful will it be for the SFDR, the EU taxonomy, how much information we can use from this report. But as Konstantina said, there's not enough data out there almost to meet these requirements. So we will be using multiple sources for the SFDR requirements, for the EU taxonomy requirements. And that's something we need to do. Again, it's something that we're researching and looking at a lot across a variety of different ESG data providers, and how we can kind of leverage all of these sources to expand on that reporting, I guess.
And if I may, I just want to add a follow-on question for you is, when you're inputting all of this stuff, what are the uses, what are all the different functions that you need it for, and how do you integrate it into the existing technology and processes of the firm? It's giving it to your PMs, your analysts, the middle office, I guess, in terms of risk management, reporting, the compliance teams, the client servicing teams. It's a lot. So how easy or difficult is it to make sure that as you're onboarding all of this data and creating these reports, that it's something that can be utilized operationally everywhere?
Yeah, so I think this is something that we're very much working on right now. We do have centralized databases for the investment team. So we have a centralized area that they can get all of this information from in one spot. And we're trying to plug in the data points to that. We create our own ESG ratings for all of our coverage. We do that through our own methodology and our own process, but we use this third-party data kind of to complement it, as I mentioned, just as another source of information that helps us to create these ratings. So there is for the investment team, we have this one-stop shop where they can get all this information plugged in. Obviously, we need to do a lot of training with the investment team to make sure they understand what data is out there and how they should be using it. And then that's part of what we're doing right now as well. As for the rest of the company, yes, there's, I'm sure everyone on this panel will understand that there is just so many people screaming out for this information internally, not to mention externally. So we are working about how we share this data across all of the teams, whether it's risk compliance, for example, they need to see this information as well when they're, for example, running screens on funds, etc. So it is a challenge. It involves a lot of work with the IT team to ensure it's there. But for us as a sustainable investing team, we're here to really ensure that the information is of a high standard, of good quality, and that it's meeting the needs that the investment team need as part of their investment decision making.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, I've got a question from the audience that I'd like to put to you. You sort of already talked about this a little bit. Without regulatory requirements, ESG reporting is essentially voluntary or done in cooperation with you. So this skews the data towards companies that are willing to disclose and who are therefore, one assumes, already conscious of ESG issues and want to score well. What are the ways, the basic, I guess, the basic metrics to deal with this bias? First of all, they're assuming that the question assumes there is this bias. It seems like a reasonable supposition, but maybe, Lisa, you can tell us if that bias is accurate, and if so, how do you kind of deal with it?
Yeah, I would definitely say this bias is accurate. Yes. So you see this in the ESG ratings as well. The large companies in general have a higher ESG score just because they're disclosing so much more. They have more resources. They have all these capabilities to do so. Again, yeah, it has to come back to the company itself. So again, engagement. And then, yeah, ask the company itself, have conversations with them, try to understand better what they're doing. I mean, we do have, you kind of see a little bit of this trend coming in where we trying to use some external data like satellite images to see how palm oil plantations are doing, for example. So then you don't rely on the company at all anymore. You kind of have like this external source, but obviously that data is very hard to come by. So it's not really a big thing yet, although it might be growing. But yeah, try to focus, have the investment manager talk to the company themselves and focus on those issues that are very key in a sector, because this can be very general. I mean, there are often sectoral issues. So frameworks like SASB or other frameworks, they try to focus and try to pinpoint those sectors, those issues within sectors. So, if you hand those things to an investment manager and tell them, go to the company, talk to them, ask specific information on these issues, you might learn so much more. I mean, don't go asking an insurance company about water usage, but, ask them about how we treat our data. And that also helps, just don't give the investment manager like a responsibility to ask hundreds of questions, just focus on the ones that are relevant. Yeah, and then
do you get to a point where maybe with some of these smaller companies that if they're not that responsive, or they don't have the capacity to meet all these questions from all these investors, do you kind of give them the benefit of doubt and just try to operate on some sort of statistical metric of whether or not they rate, or do you have to you can't really account for that, you just have to assume the worst?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think in general we lean towards benefit of the doubt, but it's difficult. It really depends on the market, on kind of the investment manager also knows how difficult it actually is for a company to get all this data. So in Hong Kong, I would be less inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt instead of like Vietnam, Indonesia, because we do know those challenges on the ground. So it's a subjective choice.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much.
If I may just weigh in there on that point, yeah, I think it's difficult to kind of determine what's like I mentioned earlier, right? A CCC rating doesn't mean the company is always bad. So I think just I would say take efforts to engage, make sure there is no past controversies or let's say mismanagement of ESG issues. That's a good sign. So we've come across in my experience companies that have the best on paper policies on health and safety or maybe child labor, whatever, but every few months you see controversies coming out. So you might have a good PR team and a legal team to draft those policies, but you're not able to implement them well. That's a good sign for me that, okay, even though the company is rated, let's say a AA or whatever, there is still gaps. So I think you just need to kind of add that perspective or context when you're looking at ESG stuff. And the other thing, and this is more for companies, but even if like not disclosing essentially isn't a smart strategy anymore, it was maybe a few years back, because you get the benefit of doubt. The rating agencies will give you, let's say 3 on 10, which is like neither good, neither bad, but you still are not worst of the worst. But now I think because of, again, more data availability, more ability to kind of normalize across industry, you can estimate what a company, let's say company's carbon emissions are, or how bad it would be in terms of their supply chain management, etc. And investors are forming a view irrespective of whether you disclose or not. So rather you tell your story versus allow anyone to estimate that, essentially.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Hardik. Question from the audience, Konstantina, maybe you can field this one. I think it's up your area. The way they've posed the question is a little cheeky, but I think it sort of cuts the heart of what they're trying to ask. To what extent or when do you anticipate regulation to, what they say, clean up the ESG data vendor zoo? So obviously, a lot of people are probably going to be frustrated with the variety and discrepancies, right? Because there's a lot of there's a lot of providers of ratings and so on. I guess when you're rating a normal a normal financial metric, ratings tend to be they travel in a line together, right? They correlate. But with ESG, because the definitions can be so radically different. One company might be rated totally differently by 2 different companies, two different agencies. So maybe, Konstantina, you can give us a sense of how you try to bring some coherence to this when you've got very different ratings on the same company.
I mean, again, bringing the European example, I think the regulation actually feeds the ESG data instead of cleaning it up. But obviously, Europe at the moment is the guinea pig of the world, and we all learn from them. So how we help our clients? So we do the job for them, actually. So we have gone through the evaluation of about more than 50, if I remember correctly, data vendors, and this is an ongoing process as well. And we have limited down to 6 that cover the whole spectrum of ESG data in terms of coverage, quality, methodology, and focus. So as I mentioned before, there may be different types of focuses on the climate, on the controversies, on the stress testing, on social and human aspects. So the selection of the vendors, it was very careful to meet this criteria, and also going back to the cost. Obviously, you don't want to have 3 vendors and paying like big dollars to all 3 of them. So we have managed to negotiate licensing agreements that we can pass through to our clients and reduce the cost as well. So making it a more cost-efficient way of reaching out to bigger data sets, that the quality and the coverage has already been filtered by us. So as I said before, like evaluating vendors is a very time-consuming process. So I think our clients really appreciate the fact that this has been done for them. And the conversation, is day 1 is on level 2. So we don't start from level 0. We help them to skip some steps in the process.
Okay, thanks. Marion, just listening to some of the both from some of the questions we've had and some of the comments, in Europe, they mandate a lot of things, and that's created a huge volume of data. In Asia, the regulatory approach has been different, but obviously is moving in the same direction, but perhaps at different paces and with different requirements. When you've got all this data and all these vendors and and the zoo, as that one question called it, does too much or does huge amounts of disclosure make it easier for companies to greenwash, or does it make it easier for investors and analysts to identify greenwashing?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think greenwashing is something that everyone's talking about right now. And I think it'll take time for companies to kind of come to agreement on reporting standards for ESG practices. I think it'll take time for there to be comparable data across sectors, across companies, etc. I think greenwashing is a concern, but I also think it's kind of a natural bump on the road to transitioning to this global sustainable economy that we're looking for. I think it's somewhat expected in some ways. I think from an investor perspective, in order for us to gain confidence in a company's sustainable performance, we need to do our own due diligence. So data is great and we use that data to complement it, but our own due diligence in companies, in peers, in industry standards, et cetera, is essential for us to ensure that we're not greenwashing or that we're not investing in companies that are greenwashing. So we have a large analyst team that do their own ESG research. We ensure it's done through our investment analyst team, not just through our ESG team. They visit sites, they look at financial reports, and they'll also look at the ESG data. Another reason kind of that we've taken our sustainability ratings internally is because, and Hardik touched on this, a lot of the data out there is from a current position or from historical, the company's historical position. And it's really important from a sustainability perspective that we've got a forward-looking evaluation of the company's trajectory on ESG issues. There could be a company that on paper right now is not doing so well in ESG matters, but they have invested massively, for example, in R&D to improve their sustainability standards. I think also companies need to be proactive, engaging with stakeholders. If they have a fear that potentially they're viewed as doing too much greenwashing, they need to reach out to their stakeholders and really have that discussion of what they're doing and improvements they are making, etc. So I think, yes, there's a lot of global regulation, industry standards out there, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. But the problem right now is there's still kind of that infamous word, a journey to take to get to the kind of right position.
Yeah. Okay. Liza, when you're looking at the trend in regulation, what would be some things that you would like to see Asian regulators can do? Like, what's the best practices that you think as an investor and asset owner would help in these regions that they can maybe take away from the European experience, but not have to replicate that experience?
Well, I think one of the we need regulation, and we need to have those companies disclose more. You see the mistake that's been often made in Europe, in my opinion, is that they're just asking for way too much data. So it's becoming a huge burden for companies themselves. And then for us, it's very difficult to actually use this data. So one of the best things that, be selective on what we ask from companies to report on, ask for those things that are relevant for that sector, and don't ask too much, because otherwise it's just companies feel like such a burden that they have to report so much, and in the end it's not being used. And that's really one of, I think, one of the pitfalls of this, because you'll get all those companies against you because they don't see the benefit, but it's a huge cost for them. And that's something we really have to, this is the journey the EU is still going through as well, with their do no significant harm standards that they're trying to set. Their first one was just way too many data points for those companies, and they've been decreasing those, which is good. But yeah, make it practical for that specific company in a specific sector. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got a number of questions coming in. And there's a kind of a common theme in these questions. They're very interested in cost and value of data, and data as well as the qualitative side of the work that you guys are all doing. So Konstantina, maybe you can give us a sense, because you evaluate so many vendors. This person would like to know, what's your view of what's the value, not in terms of a price number, but the relative value of human analysis based ratings versus AI? You know, because there are some vendors that are purely AI. I guess they're trying to get a sense of, you know, how effective are these AI only or AI heavy processes or platforms versus ones that are much more people looking at analyst report stuff.
Yeah, so the two different groups of methodologies that both have the advantages and disadvantages, and to my opinion, they don't compete with each other, they complete each other. So you have the analyst driven that, similarly to a credit agency rating, they will do a deep dive on the balance sheets, they will look at the fundamentals. They will also look at the forward-looking, you know, work that the company may be doing. They will engage very often with the companies themselves to understand you know, the numbers, like why is it like that? What are you doing to change that? And what is your strategy around ESG and all that? And then they apply the methodology to get the score. Then the artificial intelligence is what is happening now. Obviously, the analyst-driven ones are very labor-intensive. It takes time, and you will get the score updated like once, best case twice a year. Now, the AI is a daily process. Like they scrap the news, they apply a sentiment, they give you the trend, the momentum of a score. So the different approaches. Of course, when it comes to biases on the artificial intelligence side, you will see biases on developed world, because those companies appear on the news more often. Large cap companies, again, because they appear in the news more often. And when it comes to smaller companies in emerging markets, or especially, you know, small countries globally, it's either something that's gone really well or really bad to appear in the news. So you get that bias quite often. So you need to assess the methodology of the artificial intelligence vendor to see how they smoothen the data, how they, you know, the winds are right, they take away the tail, so the extreme scenarios, and how they standardize the data to give you a good representation of the ESG score of the company. So there is value in both approaches for sure. And I understand the challenge with the cost, but I believe that having both is beneficial.
Yeah, I guess what the person's trying to get at is, you may not be able to answer this, but just, you know, maybe is the cost to value ratio of one changing versus the other? Like, are we seeing the AI stuff becoming relatively more expensive or relatively cheaper compared to the qualitative?
Yeah, so the AI will be typically cheaper because, you know, there are smaller companies, they apply artificial intelligence to derive the scores, while the analyst driven will have like teams of analysts that go through. It's very labor intensive, so it tends to be much more expensive. So going back to like how we implement ESG in our investment decision making process, one doesn't need to make leaps. First, we need to make steps. Like engaging with the vendor, you know, it's not a lifetime relationship. You can always switch. It's like if you're in the early steps of your ESG journey, you don't have to throw the big bucks and then realize, oh, you know what, this vendor is actually not that good for me. You can always, you know, amend. As I said before, flexibility is key when it comes to ESG reporting.
thanks. I just want to try to fit in one or two last questions if we can get these done quickly. Hardik, questions about regulation keep coming up. It's been a big part of the today's topic. Do you see lobbying efforts to make, in this case, they're asked about Hong Kong, to create uniform disclosure requirements, blah, blah, blah. I guess basically who is conducting this kind of lobbying? So basically, if people are interested in trying to engage with regulators to come up with optimal rules, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I mean, my suggestion would be to not have country or region specific lobbying. We're already seeing efforts happening at a global level. So think about the GRI standards, which most corporates have been following for a couple of decades now almost. The SASB, which is more popular in the last 5-7 years, as well as the integrated reporting frameworks. These are all in some format trying to kind of coalesce into a more standardized framework. So there has already been announcement in the last 1 year or so where the bodies who are kind of creating these standards are saying we're trying to work together to create a more single kind of a standard rather than like 3 or 5 different standards. So I think that is the right platform where you would want to put your weight behind as an investor or as an asset owner. I mean, unless you are just a regional investor. So let's say if you're just investing in Singapore equities or bonds, then you might want to go to MAS or SGX and try and influence that. But assuming you're a more global investor, I think these bodies might be a better way to kind of share your views. And I think investors have said a lot already. So that's why you see a lot of these steps already being taken.
Okay, Konstantina, I'm going to last one for you. This question is actually for the asset managers, but I don't know if it's something that they can answer in a public forum. But you might have a way of giving a rough guide here because you work with so many clients. And people are, a couple questions in this vein. What is the average spend, the data spend that organizations use for ESG data? This person says, what should I recommend to my board? So Konstantina, can you give a sense when you deal with your clients and customers, what are they looking at across the board? Not just with you, but in general, budgeting.
It varies so much. I can't give an answer. I know of very large asset managers that they engage a large number of data vendors. So I also have large teams of ESG analysts, and they have large budgets for ESG. But I also know asset managers that, again, they're at the beginning of this ESG journey. They're going small until they get a good feeling about the data, they understand their strategy and the vision and how this will be implemented on the front, the middle, and the back office. How are they going to report to their investors? Because this is key in APAC region. And, they will take it from there. They will grow. There's no question about that because as people say, ESG is here to stay. It's not a nice to have anymore. So the budget will definitely grow. But until people really understand where they're going and how the data set will be used, and what is, how they're going to settle this ESG movement within their organization, they're going small before they go big. And again, the data vendors that they're very popular, of course, they would charge more. They have better coverage, maybe not. So it depends. Artificial intelligence, they charge less. So it depends also on the size of the asset manager. If you would like to give me a more defined answer, please drop me a line, and I can work some numbers for you.
Great, thank you very much. We are out of time. I would like to first of all thank the audience for all the great questions. I think we got most of them in, and we appreciate that. I'd like to thank State Street for sponsoring this with DigFin. And finally, of course, our wonderful panelists for sharing so much great information. So Marion O'Donnell from Fidelity International, Hardik Shah from GMO, Liza Jansen from Prudential Corporate Asia, and Konstantina Founta from State Street. Thank you, everybody. Have a great morning. From DigFin, I'm Jame DiBiasio. Bye-bye.